We're going to get started here. Thank you all so much for being here. We're very excited to have Anna Maria Spagna here tonight to do a Red Barn event with us. My name is Randy. I'm the Development Associate here at the Wenatchee River Institute. We're a nonprofit with a mission to connect people, communities, and the natural world. With me tonight is Joshua, our community programs educator. He's helping to make it possible for folks to interact with their event at home and then record it later for people to watch on our YouTube channel. And then we also have Lissy, our fabulous volunteer serving beverages. Thank you, Lissy. The Wenatchee River Institute works towards our mission through our youth and community education programs. Our youth programs deliver hands-on curricula up and down the Wenatchee Valley and along the Columbia River with our Traveling Naturalist program. This week, we're holding midwinter break camp here on campus, so it's been really fun to see kids tromping around and having a good time all day when they're off school. And then our community programs reach people through many Red Barn events like this, and then our seasonal nature walks, workshops, and then our gardens as well. We have a community garden just down the way. Just by a raise of hands, how many people have never come to a Red Barn event before, just out of curiosity? Oh my goodness, this is great. Welcome. We're so excited to have you. Has anyone never come to a workshop or anything else? Never, yeah. Well, great. Well, I'm so excited to get some new faces in here. And if you guys really like the Red Barn event and our strategic plan, we're really trying to get feedback from all of you so that we can better our programs and bring more to our community. I do have a QR code at the end of the slide that I'll put up there, or there's one on our welcome table over there if you have 5 minutes after this. Anywho, I'll go on. Another aspect of WRI is our effort to connect Indigenous peoples to their ancestral lands here. So now I would like to take some time to go over our land acknowledgement with you all. This land acknowledgement was created alongside the Chimpesk people. We are spreading the message they wish to be spread to the public. The land Wenatchee River Institute sits on is the ancestral homelands of the Chimpesk, Piscosa, or Wenatchee people. The Chimpesk, meaning people in between, had villages positioned along the Wenatchee River and surrounding areas. Their ancestral homelands extends from the Cascade Ridge throughout what is now known as the Wenatchee and Okanagan valleys. The culture and economy of the Chimpesk people centers on taking care of the land. They fish, hunt, gather roots and berries, basket-making materials, and medicines. The Chimpesk are named within the Yakima Treaty of 1855. Language to establish the Wenatchee Reservation was never followed through, even with the needed surveying completed. Many Chimpesk now live on the Culver Reservation, 150 miles northeast of Leavenworth. They were forced off their land here, and the U.S. government moved them to this reservation. The Chimpesk people are still alive today. They continue to practice their culture, harvest their traditional foods and medicines, and hold their ceremonies passed down from their ancestors. Most people won't see or notice them, but they continue to be on the land that they are connected to. Their traditional language, in Hamchin, and an interior Salish dialect, and we would like to welcome you all by saying hello in their language. Tilhusht. We offer this land acknowledgement as the first step to amplifying Indigenous voices and recognizing the harm done to them as a people. We stand as an ally to recognize their connection to the land and their rights to practice their culture on these sacred lands. We encourage all to learn about the Indigenous peoples of the place you now call home. The Wenatchee River Institute is committed to sharing this land acknowledgement and following up with other actions to educate and be respectful. Thank you. And I would also like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, because these events would not be possible without them, and then donors and supporters like you all. So I just want to take a moment to thank the City of Leavenworth, Rhine House, Icicle Brewing Company, South Restaurants, North Central Washington Audubon Society, Munchen House, Sleeping Lady Mountain Resort, Sage Mountain Natural Foods, Gustav's, Abertal Inn, Chocolat, Barron House, the Cove Resort at Fish Lake, Tierra Learning Center, Riverfront Rock Gym, and Rimmer and Rotor Construction. So thanks again to them. And also, fun fact, I also happen to be the events coordinator at a book for all seasons, and it's partnered with the bookstore today. So if you'd like to pick up any of Anna Maria's books after the event, I will be back there in the corner. You can come say hi. And A Book for All Seasons is Leavenworth's local indie bookstore, just located on Front Street, just a couple blocks that way. And you can, we'll be back here in the barn actually on March 12th. We're going to be welcoming best-selling author TJ Klune, which is super exciting. So hopefully I'll see some familiar faces at that event. All right, and without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Ana Maria Spagna is the author, most recently of Pushed, Miners, a Merchant, and Maybe a Massacre. Her previous books include Up Lake, Restless Essays of Coming and Going, Reclaimers, Stories of Elder Women Reclaiming Sacred Land and Water, Test Ride on the Sunnyland Bus, winner of the River Teeth Literary Nonfiction Prize, 100 Skills You Need for the End of the World as We Know It, a humor and feels exploration of how to live more lightly on the planet, as well as a middle grade novel, The Luckiest Scar on Earth, and a poetry chapter, Mile Marker 6. Ana Maria's work has also been recognized by the Society of Environmental Journalists, as well as a 4-time finalist for the Washington State Book Award. She lives in Stehekin, Washington with her wife, Lori. And thank you, Ana Maria, and thank you all, and enjoy the presentation. Thank you.
The clicker is on here. Hello. Thanks so much for coming out this evening. Such a beautiful evening with the moon over the river and coming up, all that smell. I feel like coming to a home place, coming to the Red Barn. Thanks to Wenatchee River Institute, and thanks to A Book for All Seasons, which is actually the best independent bookstore in the world, as we all know. Yeah. I am thrilled to be here with a lot of old friends and new friends and friends I've yet to meet to talk about Pushed, Miners, a Merchant, and Maybe a Massacre, a book that came out while I was working as a visiting professor in way upstate New York, and people were quite interested in it. But it was a place they couldn't even imagine. I had to show pictures of bluffs with no trees so they knew what I was talking about. So I feel like here I'm sharing it with people who understand the place, who know what I'm talking about. It's a book that means a lot to me. It started as a book that was, like all my books, kind of a love song to the place that I've lived, the place that I love, our region that's been home to, interior Salish people for millennia, and it's been my home for my entire adult life, and the same for many of you, I'm sure. It then became a mystery that I was intent to solve. It took 5 years. I can't tell you whether I solved it or not. And then it became unearthing history that I had never learned and was somewhat embarrassed, even ashamed that I had never learned in 3 decades in this region. And eventually it became an exploration of our culture of racism and xenophobia and the insidious ways that persists in our culture. So it's all of those things at once. I'm gonna read a little bit from the book to start us off, to give you a sense of what's going on. I'm gonna ask you some questions and then show you slides, visuals. More than any book that I've written, this is one where visuals seem to help. So I'll show some slides, and then hopefully we'll have some time for you all to ask me questions. So without further ado, I'm gonna start in reading a little bit from the prologue that just gives you a sense of where I began and what I started to discover at the beginning. Is the volume okay, Joshua? Are we doing okay? All right. A few years ago, while waiting for the ferry, I browsed the shelves at Riverwalk Books, another very fine independent bookstore, and picked up a paperback titled Wapato Heritage, The History of the Chelan and Tiat Indians by Tom Hackenmiller. Why? Because a new tugging had begun. Simple questions that may have been easy enough to answer in some places are murkier here. Who came before us? What did they do? Who and what did they love? How did they experience red heather ridges or 2 long winter nights? As I read and reread the book, one story stagged my attention. This one wasn't exactly about the original inhabitants, or not them alone. In the late 1860s, a Chinese merchant settled on the banks of the Columbia River directly across from Chelan Falls, where Beebe Bridge Park now sits. The merchant ran a thriving business, the first of its kind along this rugged upper stretch of river, and he catered to indigenous Chinese and white people alike. But within a decade, tensions grew heated. One day, on a high bluff within view of the store, according to lore, a group of indigenous people murdered a large number of Chinese miners, perhaps as many as 300. and pushed the bodies over a cliff into the Columbia. Locals dubbed the event the Chelan Falls Massacre. A massacre? Perhaps as many as 300 killed? Why had I never heard this story? Truth is, I'd never even heard about Chinese gold miners along the Columbia, though I should have. I knew very little about Chinese people in the American West, though I've lived my entire life here. But I did know Beebe Bridge Park, a flat, grassy campground constructed in the mid-1990s and popular with RVers in summer. I'd often camped there on my way to or from the once-a-day ferry to Stehekin. Beebe Bridge had always seemed a nondescript, in-between sort of place. To think of Beebe Bridge as historically relevant felt surprising, astonishing even, a welcome challenge to assumptions I didn't even know I'd held. This simple connection at first spurred me on. Over time, the story grew more complicated. Not long after beginning research, I began to hear another theory about the Chelan Falls Massacre. First, as a scandalous whisper, you know what they say. Then, as a steady hum, sons and daughters of the sons and daughters of the first white settlers voiced the possibility the attackers weren't indigenous people. They were white men dressed up to look indigenous. The possibility infuriated me. Of course, xenophobia isn't innate, but instilled, a political tool and excuse. None of this was new. None of this could be substantiated. And because the facts remained so murky, I'd learn, some historians believed the massacre never occurred at all. Suddenly, a made-up massacre seemed possible too. If a place comes to own you, does its history own you too? I believe it does. I've read 1,000 pages and driven hundreds of miles trying to figure out the truth about this forgotten massacre. I used to think of forgetting as benign, such a gentle verb, to forget. Now I'm not so sure. I own land in Chelan County. I've benefited as much as anyone and more than most from the murders of non-white people. The sin of forgetting is at least partly mine. So call this a remembering, a search with no end, a river with multiple sloughs, a group of indigenous people massacred a few Chinese men, or 300 of them, or white men massacred them, or it didn't happen at all. Tributaries trickle and flood and sometimes run dry. Who believes which story and why? Why tell the story at all? And I'll stop right there. That gives you a hint of the beginning. Like I said, I didn't even know about the history of Chinese people in this region, and I'm assuming many of you know more than I do, or some of you do. I hope people are like, no, I don't. Yeah, maybe you do. But so I think I want to start with you just visiting with your neighbors, and there are two questions. These are two questions I want you to consider. If there were, historians estimate that in 1870 there were about 800 white settlers in our region. And by our region, I mean sort of the upper Columbia from the Cascade Crest to the Columbia River and then up to Canada. In that region, 800. If there were 800 white people, how many Chinese do you think there were? Question number one. And question number two is, what do you think the Chinese immigrants were doing for work? So just spend a couple minutes and visit with your neighbors, see what answers you come up with. How many do you think? I will rudely interrupt your conversations. I love this. The crowd has a lot to say about this. Does anybody just call it out? How many Chinese do you think were in the region if there were 800 whites? How many? 2,500. That's a little high. 1,000 is pretty good. That's real close. 1,500, so twice as many Chinese as there were white settlers, which was astonishing to me. Astonishing that the first immigrants that really came in and made this place home, tried to make this place home, were Chinese people. What do you think they were doing for work? Railroads. Was it the railroads? Mining. Other things they were doing? Farming. Drug smuggling, surely. What else? Irrigation canals. What else? Restaurants, right? Here is what I thought. I thought cleaning, maybe, laundries. I thought they were doing the railroad, right? That's the one thing I knew about them. Railroads weren't here yet in our region. We did not have railroads here yet, right? In the years that we're talking about. What else were they doing? Farming, yes. Irrigation, yes. Cleaning, yes. Doctors, yes. Merchants, yes. They were anything. They were doing all of it, right? They were doing all these jobs. But we think of them as laborers, right? As cheap labor is what I foolishly thought. Now I'm going to take a step back and say that when they first got here, in the years around the 1860s we're talking about here, they were in fact miners. They were miners when they came in. The region, we all know, like the 49ers in California, miners were down there. They played that out. They start heading north because they've heard about the Yukon, right? And so the way they travel, some of them come up as they come along the Columbia. They go to Walla Walla. They come up through Moses Coulee, if you know Moses Coulee. They come along the river and then up the Okanagan. They're headed for Canada. They're headed for places beyond. But they might as well try the Columbia, right? So they stopped, they tried it, and there wasn't a lot. They didn't do that great. The white miners did not do great, but then came the Chinese. And the Chinese did really well. And it was, that could create tensions, right? That could create tensions. Why did the Chinese do so well? There are some really interesting answers to that. One is because they came from the Pearl River region of China. They came from Guangdong, Canton, and for 10,000 years, they'd done irrigation there. So they knew how to use water to their advantage. So they had technology. What we see in this picture is what was called a rocker. Has anybody ever seen or heard of a rocker? Yeah. It's a contraption. If you want to see one, there's at the Pateros Museum, right? Is that what you were thinking, Judy?
Alaska's where I was.
Where you saw them up there, right. So the rocker is a wooden contraption through which you can sift the water. There's quicksilver. So you're not using a pan, right? You rock it back and forth so that the gold dust. So what this is doing is it's capturing the dust instead of the nuggets. You're getting the dust. And that's why the white miners might have thought it was played out. The Chinese come in with technology. And not just a simple technology like this, but then what they call a long tom. A long tom requires that you've dug a long canal to divert water so that it goes through this longer sluice box, right, with quicksilver, and again captures the dust. So there's a ditch right where, at Pateros, where the river comes into the Columbia, there's a sign off in the brush that says China Ditch. It's one of these ditches that they dug. And I thought, when I heard of it, it would be a ditch like this, like an orchard reel. Oh my goodness, no. It's a ditch, right? It's a canal that they brought the river down so that they don't have to pick up buckets of it, right? And then put it in this long term. So technology is one reason why they did better. Second reason is if you look at this picture, one thing about this technology, you can't do it alone. You know, we always see the 49ers with their pan and their donkey, right? That's what we have. These guys had to work communally. And in this picture, you can see that there are people who look like possibly white fellows, possibly indigenous people working with the Chinese, but they're working communally to do this job, so they're going to do better. So that's the second reason. The third reason is also fascinating to me, which is that they had, we're going to talk about it in a minute, little villages on the river, and in all these little villages, they grew vegetables. So the Chinese miners were healthier, right? The white miners were not eating vegetables. They're eating all these greens, and they're growing herbs, and most often they had a doctor there, a Chinese doctor. So they were much healthier. So we have actual reasons why they're doing better, right? Other than what anybody I talk to, they'd say, well, they work harder. Well, there are other reasons, right? And is this familiar when we think about other immigrants? Well, they work hard. Yeah, they're also smart, they're also communal, they're also healthy. So those are some of the reasons. This is the site of the massacre. This is the Chinese store. It's run by a merchant. It's considered the first business in the whole region, Okanagan County, Chelan County. Can you see where it is? It's pointed out. It's always just called the Chinese store. It's right across from where the Chelan River comes in. It's right where BB Bridge Park sits today. That's where it was. I spent a lot of time reading and researching it and trying to imagine what it looked like. And as happens when you do this research, someone at the Chelan Museum was, well, do you want a picture? Yeah, I do, right? There it is. And I have no idea if anybody in this room knows where this picture comes from. The museum had it. They don't know where it came from. But you can see there are several buildings. They had a pack string, a 40-horse pack string that would go to Walla Walla for supplies. They had a tin ore boat that could get people back and forth across the river, so that's part of the business. Lots of gardens, lots of lumber, because they're getting the driftwood coming down. They're milling that lumber. And probably opium as well, right? So all of these things are happening. It's a thriving village. There's the merchant of the title. I was trying a lot to figure out who this merchant is. He's famous, he's mentioned a lot. They say he's an older fellow, he's well respected. Who could he be? I got the census lists. And when you get the census, this is just a couple pages of the 1878 census. And there are lots and lots of Chinese gentlemen named Ah. That's their first name, A-H, Ah. A-H means uncle or Mr. or sir, right? But they put it down as their first name. And I'm looking for anybody who could be the merchant. One thing I knew is that he was old. They said he's very old merchant. Well, there's a 38-year-old, right? I think we count that as old in that era. He's also married. You can't see the top of this column, but this is married or unmarried. The merchant is married. His name is Ah Chi, if you can see that there. And then as I did more and more research, does anybody know a town in the region that has a name like Ah Chi? If you've read the book, Chisa, right? Chisa is the only town, Chisa way up in the Okanagan by the border, tiny Chisa, is the only town in the whole United States named after a Chinese immigrant. And it's named after a man they called Chisa, and I'm almost certain it was Ah Chi. It was the same man who owned the Chinese store. So I really feel like I'm getting somewhere with this story. So far I've told you good stories, thriving stories. They're thriving people. Things were tough for Chinese immigrants, even in that era. This is a book called the Wong Sam Phrase Book that was rediscovered by scholars in the early 1990s. And it was a book that you would pick up. This is one page out of about 300. It's a book you would pick up at the Wells Fargo office, like where the Pony Express comes through. So, I mean, one thing about it is in order to use it, you have to be literate in 2 languages, right? You have to be able to read English and the Chinese characters. And some of the things here, some of the lines are perfectly normal, right? The goods are first class. No, sir, I sell for cash. Will you sell on credit? But then you start to look closely, and it's, don't fear I'm cheating you. I cannot trust you. He perjured himself in court. The house was set on fire by an incendiary. Who needs these kinds of phrases, right? And page after page after page speaks to a life full of distrust, right? Violence. They were living a rough life. Chinese Americans are living a rough life as early as this. And I highly recommend, all you have to do is Google Wong Sam Phrase Book, and you get pages and pages of these, which are just fascinating and horrifying at once. As I mentioned when I started, the story, anywhere you see it, and you can see it, it's like at the Rocky Reach Dam, they talk about it. At the Wenatchee Museum downtown, they talk about the massacre. And it always says it was committed by indigenous people. But as I talked to living folks, people who had some memory, who have ancestors, Keith Carpenter, who had land on the Columbia River, they all said the same thing. They said no. They said it was indigenous people. I mean, it was white people dressed up as Indians. Long history of that in our country, Boston Tea Party, right? This is something that happened. It happened both to deflect blame and also to be like, you're a badass when you're an Indian, right? Why are football teams named Redskins, right? So there are lots of reasons for that, but there's a long history of it. This is from Native River by Bill Lehman, his great book about the Columbia. He found a source that talked to Shea Yu, who took over the store after Achi left, possibly because of the massacre. We don't know why. But Shea Yu said no, for sure, it was white men dressed up. I didn't know, you still like, but where did Bill Lehman get this? He can't remember. We're chasing it down. I also talked to Randy Lewis, who many of you know as a spokesperson for the indigenous folks of this region. And Randy said, absolutely it was. He says he remembers being told that it was white people who committed this. And I had been thinking at this time that it happened up the Chelan River someplace, because that's more of a bluff. If you know the area at all, the Columbia, there's no place you could push bodies off. It's too sloping. But the Chelan River is a real, yeah, it's a gorge, right? So it could happen there. Randy told me no, it happened at BB Springs, which is on the other side of the road up to Chelan. But the most troubling thing that he also told me is he said, in a long drawn out story that I hope you'll read the book and hear, he said that it happened on both sides of the river. On one side, it was the men who were killed, and on the other side, it was the women and children. And I had never heard a story like that. And Randy is not one to pass on hearsay or made up stories. So at this point, it began to seem tragic, as it always is tragic, right? But I would be remiss if I did not point out that there aren't sources for any of this, right? There is no source from 1875 when this supposedly happened. Nobody wrote it down. Nobody saved their journals. Greg Noakes, who's a great newspaper man for the Oregonian, researched a similar massacre on the Snake River in Hills Canyon, and he actually found journals where the people who did it wrote it down. Yeah, we did it. And I thought, yeah, I could find journals like that, but no, I didn't. I didn't find those. There's one newspaper report. Here's the copy of it in the Chelan Falls Leader that I had to find the old-fashioned way on microfiche. It was originally in the Spokane paper, which was the Spokane spokesman at the time, in 1891. So think about this. It happened in 1875, and the first written report is in 1891. My historian friends are thinking, this is fishy. This is fishy. If you read through it, and I have excerpts of it in the book, it's purple prose. It's, oh, the sad days when the Chinese miners worked. It's very nostalgic. It's very much far in the past describing it. And then the heathens, the savages, pushed the Celestials off the cliff. So this is the source of all the stories about the massacre. And oh, that is such a good, it was a slur, and it had to do with, long history. I'm going to skip that question for now. Yeah, I realize I could go on, whoa, Celestials. No, I'm not going to go there. I want to stay with this newspaper report because I want to talk about that. 1891 is when white settlers are really settling, if that's the word we're going to use, the region, right? That's the year that Wenatchee gets incorporated. Allotments are taking land from the indigenous people. They're selling allotments back. So a lot is going on. There are a lot of reasons why this story would come to the focus right then. The exact same issue of the Chelan Falls Leader has this kind of horrible op-ed that you can't quite read off to the side saying why no Chinese should ever be allowed to live in the region, right? Chinese are dirty. They aren't like us. They should be kept out. And as Wenatchee was becoming a city, when they were writing their charter in the same year, in the same newspaper a couple months earlier, the town council got together and they drafted a law to keep Chinese out of Wenatchee. They drafted the law. It did pass. But at least one person by the name of Noah Brown did stand up, at least at that meeting, and say no. And I'm always happy when I'm doing this history to see that there are people who at some point say, no, right? And take a step back. So there are good stories under the surface here. I'm suggesting that, there's the possibility that it didn't happen, that it may have been made up. But before we go further with that idea, I do want to point out that history, the violence against Chinese immigrants in the West was horrific. These are documented, right? This is not, none of these are mysteries. There was a massacre in Los Angeles in 1871, right downtown. If you've ever been to LA where Olvera Street is, that used to be Chinatown, and they just ran them out. They just massacred the Chinese. In the late 1870s, many Chinese businesses were burned in San Francisco. The Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in 1882, which many of you probably know of as the first anti-immigrant law in this country, keeping Chinese non-skilled laborers from entering the country. And not only that, but the ones who were here, if they went home, as people do, you go home, they could not come back. So 1885, probably the most famous massacre. This is horrible to call massacres famous. In Rock Springs, Wyoming, killed 28 people. 1885 in Tacoma, they expelled the Chinese. They took them to the docks and pushed them off. There was a recent opera in Tacoma documenting these stories are coming to the surface, right? They're bubbling up. And then Hell's Canyon, as I mentioned, in 1887. I just felt like we had to lay the groundwork and say, this really did happen. It happened all over the place in the West. And I think I'm going to skip over this one, or maybe I won't. Also, I want to bring up that before we talk about massacres that maybe didn't happen, many that did don't get as much attention as they should, right? Bear River Massacre in Idaho, Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado, Marias Massacre in Montana are all massacres where many, many indigenous people were killed, but we just don't hear about them, right? So they exist. On the other hand, strangely, there is evidence of made-up massacres. Anybody ever been to Almo, Idaho? Teeny tiny town near Craters of the Moon. And they've had this monument up for almost 100 years that is, if I can read it, it is dedicated to the memory of those who lost their lives in a most horrible Indian massacre in 1861. 300 immigrants west were attacked and only 5 escaped. This did not happen. This did not happen. There's a scholar, a Mormon scholar from the University of Utah who dedicated his whole career to proving this did not happen. And the people of Almo, they will not take this down. They will not take that down. They have fought. The Shoshone Nation has now tried to sue them to take them to, and they will not take that down. So we're going to do another question. Why would anyone make up a massacre? Yeah. This one or any other, meaning the Chelan Falls Massacre or any other. Talk among yourselves. Why would anybody make up a massacre?
Do we have any theories?
Prejudices about what? Why would you have make up a massacre? Tourism. In Almo, it brings in tourists. Not a joke. What else?
To vilify the Native Americans.
To vilify the Native Americans. Certainly that idea, right? It's a perfect timing for it when you're just running them out, right? What else? What other reasons? Pardon me?
Excuse for revenge.
Excuse for revenge.
Yeah.
So true. You know, the only massacre I remember learning when I was in school was the Whitman massacre, right? Over and over and over and over. And they never said that was the reason why we, had to retaliate. But that's the message I remember taking in, right? That retaliation had to happen after that. So retaliation to villainize tourism. Anything else? Land, sure. I mean, land is what everybody's after right then. Get a hold of that land. What about that Chinese store that's all built up? Like, somebody wants that, right? What else? Any other reasons? Yeah?
Controlling the narrative.
Controlling the narrative. Say more. What do you mean by that?
Like, because if you can pit people against each other and put yourself in this position of who is saying what's true,
Yeah.
then you can change how people view it.
Yeah, if you can put yourself in that position of being the storyteller, right, pitting people against each other, then your story becomes the one that remains, right, that remains. Anything else you can think of with Chelan Falls in particular, why it would be useful to have this massacre?
So the water rights?
Water, oh God, my goodness, yeah, water always was valuable. I'm sure that played into it in some way. There's a ditch coming down. Anything else? Drugs are always a possibility, right? There was certainly opium going back and forth across the border.
Just to take the land.
Yeah, land again, right? Take the land. You have an excuse for it, right? Totally. Also, it explains why they're gone. Like, as I was going through this, I kept saying, look, we had all these Chinese folks in our region. Why aren't they here anymore? And people would say, well, you know about the massacre. And I'm thinking, I don't think that's the whole reason why Chinese folks aren't in the region anymore, right? But it's an excuse. It's a way to say, well, that happened, then they got scared off, and then they wouldn't want to stay. When in fact, there were all kinds of laws. There was all kinds of subtle and not subtle oppression, as we saw in the Wong Sam phrase book, right? There were all kinds of reasons why it was difficult for Chinese to stay. They're trying to run them out of Wenatchee. They didn't stay in Wenatchee because they couldn't stay in Wenatchee, right? But instead, we say, yeah, but they were massacred. That's what happened. So there are lots of reasons I can think why it might have been made up. Any others anybody could think of?
Well, in
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
there's also no physical, no bones.
There are no bones, and this is huge. This is huge section of the book because not only would you always find bones after something like this, but to the Chinese in particular, bones were really important. They actually had, because of tradition and religion, they wanted to repatriate all bones of Chinese immigrants. And so they had bone collectors who were hired by Chinese companies to go all over the West, and you have charts of what bones they were supposed to collect, and they put the names on them, and they went back to the villages. And as I was getting to just trying so hard with this research, I got in touch with people who had connections to China, who knew these towns that they came to, and said, no, there aren't bones from that massacre, right? So it was another reason why I thought maybe it didn't happen. Maybe there weren't these massacres, or not in these big numbers. All of that said, I really want to end with, there's a whole chapter toward the end of the book called The Problem with Make-Believe. And none of this will be, all of this will be familiar to all of you, but I think it's important to bring this back around when I come close to suggesting that maybe it didn't happen. Which brings us to a critical point about believing in made-up massacres. Not believing in real ones is worse. As troubling as it may be to dredge up our violent past, real or imagined, deniers of atrocities have done far more damage with motives far more insidious. From the Holocaust to 9/11, deniers have fostered a dangerous debunking In the case of the Holocaust, denying the gas chamber deaths of 6 million humans nurtures anti-Semitism as kindling for the next convocation and I can't even say the word now, but we know that, right? Now we have Gaza, right? In the case of Native Americans, denying the horrors allows descendants and or benefactors of those who stole land, killed women and children, and decimated species like the American bison in an effort to starve fellow humans to cleanse ourselves of guilt. And those are only the most widely known denier conspiracies. There's a familiar dynamic at work, the myriad ways the powerful find to silence the powerless. Consider the Me Too movement. Police killing Black people, the unsolved murders of transgender and Indigenous women, generations of abused altar boys. In every case, the weight of credulity leans hard toward the powerful, though they hardly need it. Who can hide evidence? Who can rewrite the report? Who can intimidate witnesses? Not the victims. For this reason, if there's any chance an atrocity occurred, we ought not dismiss it out of hand. There was no Holocaust of Chinese people in the West, but there was systematic oppression, a squeezing out. There were mass murders, some gruesome enough to earn the moniker of Massacre, and many small-scale events. There was also a long chain of violent exclusions from Eureka, California, to Bellingham, Washington. By the 1880s, quote, anti-Chinese violence became a vital expression of working-class manliness, writes Beth Lou Williams. Even as Chinese Americans acted with valiant resistance, the forces of tyranny accrued against them. About that, there is no titillating intrigue, no mystery. There's no doubt whatsoever. So I will stop there. Yeah. We have lots of time for questions, and I would love to answer anything you'd like to know about the book, about the research, about things that came up.
Something you just said right at the end, I don't want to forget it.
Yeah.
You said that they collected the bones. Is it possible that the bones were collected by other Chinese after that?
Possibly, but they kept pretty good records of bones when they collected them, and they sent them back to China. Now, if they had collected them and done something else with it, because not all Chinese bones went back to China. If you go to Walla Walla, there are Chinese in the cemetery there. Did they take them and bury them elsewhere? Did they honor them otherwise? Did they go to the bottom of the river? There are people in Chelan who say that when Rocky Reach Dam came up, that Chinese bodies floated up. And I thought, now that's crazy talk. That cannot have happened. But when I talked to Bob Mierendorf, the longtime archaeologist for North Cascades National Park, he said, well, if they were in wood.
He said what?
If there was wood involved, there could be, right? They could. He just was not going to dismiss that out of hand. So I said, okay, it's a possibility. Yeah. It's getting gory here. Other questions about these things? Yeah, Teresa.
I love the way you tied together present day attitudes towards immigrants and attitudes towards at that time.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about that parallel?
Yeah, so Teresa's asking about how I tied together present day attitudes with attitudes back then. And I wrote this book between 2017 and 2021. So there is a lot of xenophobia rising in the country. And at first, I was thinking how much our attitudes toward Hispanic people in this region mirror the attitudes that we had towards Chinese at one time. And that's where I focused my research, and that's where I was doing a lot of the comparison. And then, once again, just when you least expect it, here comes the pandemic, and what are we calling it? The Chinese flu, right? And there's violence all over the country against Asian people. So that becomes part of the story again. And I guess that what I'm doing is I'm being transparent about my own naivete, that just when I would think, no, we don't have those problems anymore, we just have these, then there it comes again, whack-a-mole again, right? Our racism comes up. So over and over, It was just trying to find those stories. I also want to say, though, Teresa, because you've read the book and you know this, that I tried to talk to as many people with as many perspectives, and people have wildly different perspectives on all of this, right? And some of the immigrants that I talked to, they really want to emphasize how good people have been to them, right? No matter what, yes, we are a country of racism. Yes, we're a country of xenophobia, and yet people were good to them when they came in. And they would steadfastly refuse to let me, like Claire Thompson says, own that narrative and say, we've always been bad to immigrants, because that's not the whole story either, right? And so I tried very hard to listen to those stories. I also talked to Arnie Marchand, if any of you know Arnie, who is up in the Okanagan. He's quite a character. He has a wonderful book called The Way I Heard It. It's all the stories, indigenous and local, all the lore of the region. He's fantastic. And I met him on a trip to the museum up in Oroville. And I said, oh, have you ever heard of the Chinese Massacre? And he says, oh yeah, that's when we killed off all those Chinese people. Oh my goodness. He says, yeah, we killed 700 of them. And I thought, what the heck? And so I thought, okay, he's a blowhard. I'm going to go home. I'm going to do more research. And I thought, well, he did say 700. And before I put that in the book, I better go spend some time with Arnie. So I spent a whole day driving around, learning his stories of the indigenous people, of the Okanagan people. And every time I would say, what about the Chinese? He would say, basically, who cares? They were here for 20 years. We have been here for thousands of years. Will you pay attention? Will you pay attention? And I honor that, right? I honor that he's saying that. And then I would say 700, he'd say, yeah, 700. So, right? So there's another story. Yeah.
In your research, did you ever come across like anything like relatives or descendants of?
No.
I think that there'd be some.
You would think there would be some story. Even the relatives of Achi, of Chisa, who are mostly in Canada now, they don't know anything of the story. They don't know, they know, their father's story of moving. So many, you may know if you drive 97A ever, that there was a big earthquake in 1872, that actually the rocks came down and dammed up the whole river, and people could run back and forth across. So one version of the story is that the Chinese merchant left because of the earthquake. That's why he got out of here. And then others say he left because of the massacre. The years don't line up. Massacre was 1875, earthquake was 1872. And if you can look at Sam Miller's store ledger at the museum downtown, which is totally fascinating, and you'll see many, many Chinese names, many, many Chinese names, many, many earthquake, still Chinese names, still Chinese names. 1875, none. And then they start coming back. So it's a short time that they're gone, but something happened in 1875. So, yeah.
I want to piggyback, Teresa.
Yeah.
Because I read the book in January, and I love the way you write. And what shifted most for me was how we even view history. The doubt, the uncertainty, the lack of details, the misinformation or different information was somewhat unsettling to me, because we grew up in a time where history was linear, and this is how we were taught.
Linear and objective and factual, and there's one voice, and this is what history is, right? Instead of this mess of stories that people tell all different ways, right?
And my friends and I work at the Greater Leavenworth Museum, and that there's a lot of good details there, but it might not be the whole story.
Right? They might not be the whole story. And why stand up and say, this is the story, right? Even if I wrote this book and I just decided I'm not putting anything about Arnie and 700 dead, right? Because that's crazy talk. I need to. That's one story, right? Wow. You're right. You can't just decide I'm only going to tell what's documented, because there's nothing documented. And even when there is documented, who gets to document? Claire Thompson will tell you, it's who's powerful, right? It's the person who controls that narrative. And so it is a story about that too. I mean, it's a book about how history is made, right? Yeah.
So you had that census list in there, and I know you said that you didn't find descendants or whatever, but I mean, often people move together. So, I mean, did you try to find other records after that time in other parts of the U.S. or whatever, where maybe those same names came up?
Those names are so common, so ubiquitous. Chi is actually a little bit rare, but most of the other ones are so common, it would be almost impossible. It would be, because they're doing this using uncle and essentially a first name, it would be like having a list of Mr. John, Mr. Derek, Mr., and that would be very hard to chase down. But I tried to chase down mining records, mining claims, things like that, land ownership to find things. Another thing about census is that like indigenous people or oppressed people everywhere, the Chinese weren't lining up to sign up for the census, right? They were hiding from the census because they were going to get taxed, if nothing else, for their gold dust. So I think the census underrepresents the Chinese in the region for sure. Yeah.
About what we've lost from not having that
Right?
Chinese wealth of brilliance and
All of that
knowledge
culture, right?
All that culture.
All that culture. Yeah.
And that it puts your sins of how to have some sense of reciprocity or social justice out of this.
Or at least to bring back the stories, right? At least bring them back. Has anybody been down? John Day has a fabulous new museum in honor of a Chinese merchant there, right? And his store and the objects that were in the store and the people who frequented the store. And just that you can be driving through what I think of as cowboy country, right? It's John Day, right? It's sagebrush, it's tumbleweeds, and come across this really quite fine, sophisticated, store that was there in the same era, right? So more of that, more telling the stories of what they were here. If nothing else, tell the story that the miners were successful, not because they worked hard, because they had technology, because they worked together, because they were healthier, right? All those other stories. Yeah, Claire.
I wonder, I'm thinking about this idea of who writes history and who controls the narrative, and how there's so many different stories that don't get recorded. Yet on the other hand, I feel like sometimes in our current era of extreme polarization, we talk about how the problem is we don't have a common reality anymore. And everyone's working from their own just totally different version of what the facts are. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on how to balance that. How do you make sure that everyone's story gets told and every perspective is honored and respected, yet at the same time, is there still some kind of way to find actual common ground or common reality?
Well, those are two kind of questions, I think. Can we find common ground, and is there some truth, right? Is there some truth here? And so I was trying really hard to listen to all the stories and to honor those stories, to publish all those stories, and yet to lean toward, I think we can tell this much. We can tell that Chinese were here, that they thrived, that they did well, and that they were oppressed, right? And maybe through that, we can all find common ground with that. Can we all agree on that much, right? By listening to everybody, by honoring everybody's perspective, say, can we all agree on this much? Can we see this much as evidence? So I don't know if that's an answer, but
it makes me think about how we're going to write the history of the future.
Yes.
The history
in a way
of now includes all these perspectives, but also can have some kind of established reality that
some common ground.
I don't know.
Some common ground that we share.
Yeah.
When I'm at my most hopeful and Pollyanna-ish, I think the ground is our common ground, right? We all live here. We all get our water from that same river. We all breathe the same air. Maybe there's some common ground in that. And in a story like this that's so particularly regional, you get a real sense of that because everybody in this room, I can tell by your engagement, is proud of where you live. You love where you live. You love this place, right? The history, therefore. And that creates a certain commonality. When you're talking about a place as big as the whole United States, that gets harder. Not all drinking from the same river, right? Yeah.
Well, I just read the book by Tim Egan about the Ku Klux Klan and its blossoming in the 1920s.
Right.
And I finished that book thinking, well, I already knew a lot, but I was just so shocked at how one of every three white men in Indiana, and 95% of the people in Indiana were white. 1/3 of the men belonged to the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s.
Right.
It was like being a Rotary member.
Right.
Or, no, really. It was
Yeah.
and so
Right.
anyway, just the commonality of hatred of the other.
It's the other thing, right? And so somebody has to stand up and say no, right? Like the one man in the Wenatchee public meeting who stood up, Noah Brown stood up and said no. Did it make a difference? Nobody said no, right?
Well, I read that,
Yeah.
not in that book, but
Yeah.
that the KKK marched in the Apple Blossom Parade in the 20s.
Right?
Like, it's pervasive. It's not
Yeah.
just this region.
No.
It was the whole culture.
Of course. And that's the whole
And
point.
even
Like
if you were
it's
in
everywhere.
KKK, everybody was supporting it.
Yeah. And there's so many things that we whitewash. Like when I was writing the book, I was thinking, I grew up in Riverside, California. So I think of it as an egalitarian place. Like I went to school with Hispanic kids and black kids. We were all in school together. And then I'm telling my mom the story. She said, honey, there was forced busing. Right? That wasn't just everybody gets along. Somebody has to do something about it for that to be the reality. And I didn't know that. I was reading the history and I thought, well, they're just really, this Chinese history is in the Northwest. And then I'm reading, oh yeah, there was one in Riverside. They burned it down, right? Happens everywhere. We always think it's someplace else, don't we? Always think it's someplace else.
Burn it down, it's okay.
Right, and it's not only okay, you have a party. Yeah,
Like the Tulsa thing.
yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, right. It is now, thank goodness, right? That's the whole point, is bring the stories up and tell the stories and stand up against it when you see it and say it's wrong. What up, Holly?
Is it naive to think that maybe some of these records were kept, but in Chinese language, and then when they were discovered, were just thrown away?
I think that's really, really, really possible. How many things existed in Chinese language? That's the other thing. When we say that they were just kind of, for lack of, just laborers, we think they weren't literate. They were literate in 2 languages. You can see it on the census. So they must have written something down in Chinese or in English and it disappeared. Do we have everything that was written down? We most assuredly do not. And part of my hope is you write this book and put it out in the world and somebody will say, oh, I have something, right? Oh, do you mean this? I mean, we had a little break and Judy Clark is telling me, do you know this guy who has the pictures at Chelan Museum? I'm like, yeah, that's what I come give these talks for, is to meet those people and find out, oh yeah, there is a picture. Yeah, there is a story. You hope. Yeah, Teresa.
So you originally started your just looking for the answer to this.
Right.
When did it change for you that it was going to be a different story? That it was going to be more...
Oh, I am dogged, Teresa. I was sure there was going to be an answer, right? I just kept being sure there was going to be an answer. And it really didn't change until I got in touch with Dr. Raymond Chung, who appears late in the book. He has connections, like I said, to those villages in China. He has a brother who does data research and went through all my research with statistical analysis and looked through everything. And Ray and his brother said, Anna Maria, no. And that was when I thought. And I still thought, I'm gonna keep going. But I thought it was right at the height of all that anti-Asian sentiment during the pandemic. And I thought, let's put the book out now. Let's not sit here and wait for an answer, right? Let's not wait for an answer. Let's just put the book out and acknowledge this and get people talking, right? We've had conversations tonight. Maybe people learned a couple things. That's the whole value, right? Not the answer. Although if you have the answer, I want the answer. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Yeah, thank you all so much. I'm happy to have conversations afterwards.